The police report called it a minor disturbance, but everyone inside that restaurant knew the truth. A nobody waitress had just done what millions of dollars never could. She reached the one person Dominic Moretti loved most in the world, and by the end of the night, she would be cornered in a dark alley, caught between a rat and a king, with no way out. Here on this channel, we tell the stories nobody talks about out loud. Dangerous love, family sacrifice, and the moment ordinary people discover they are anything but ordinary. This story will remind you, the right words, spoken in silence, can be louder than any gunshot. Don't leave without hitting like, leaving a comment below, and subscribing. Because trust me, you do not want to miss what's coming next.
The Onyx Room was more than just a restaurant. It was a fortress masquerading as a high-end dining experience. Situated in the wealthiest part of Chicago's Gold Coast, it was the place the city's powerful came to act like they were saints. The light fixtures were worth more than an average house. The velvet curtains were dense enough to swallow a scream, and the servers were trained to be as unnoticeable as the air they breathed. Sophie Bennett was an expert at being unnoticeable. At 23, Sophie was a ghost dressed in a black vest. She had perfected the silent step, moving in a way that never made a floorboard creak, never rattled a single piece of silverware, and never caught a customer's attention. She was the person who took your coat and was forgotten 5 seconds later. She was the one who topped off your wine before you noticed it was low. That night, however, the kitchen air felt thick, like the electric calm before a thunderstorm. "He is on his way," the manager, Mr. Halloway, hissed, swiping a drop of sweat from his shiny bald head. He was a man who was usually all cool composure and stiff formality, but tonight he looked like he might get sick. Table 1, the secluded alcove. "I want those tablecloths pressed twice. I want that silverware so polished you can see your reflection in it. Do you understand me?" The kitchen staff erupted into a controlled panic. Head chefs were shouting, assistant chefs were shaking. Sophie stood near the espresso machine, polishing a spoon. Her heart kept a slow, heavy beat against her ribs. "Who is it?" whispered Chloe, a new hostess with more eyeliner than common sense. "Moretti," a line cook grumbled, not even looking up from the onions he was chopping. "Dominic Moretti." The name landed with a thud. The newspapers described him as a logistics consultant. The streets knew him as the undisputed new king of Chicago. He took charge of this family operation 3 years ago after his father was shot down on Walker Drive. Since then, the crime rate in his districts had bizarrely fallen, mainly because rival criminals just disappeared. He was 32, brutally handsome, and known for his quiet demeanor. As long as Moretti was talking, you were fine. The moment he went quiet, you were already gone. "He is bringing a guest," Halloway said sharply, snapping his fingers in Sophie's direction. "Bennett, you are handling water and bread on the main floor. Do not go near table 1. I am assigning Pierre to it. Pierre can handle challenging clientele." Sophie nodded, keeping her gaze down. "Yes, sir." She wanted nothing to do with table 1. She just wanted to work her shift, get her tips, and return to her quiet apartment back in Rogers Park. She had rent due, and her grandmother's medical bills were stacking up on her kitchen counter like a snowdrift. She was in no position to invite trouble, but trouble often seeks out the quietest people. By 8 p.m., the restaurant was buzzing with activity. The lights were low, casting a warm amber light. Sophie weaved between the tables, pouring sparkling water, skillfully avoiding unwanted advances from drunk financiers and keeping her head down. Then, the main doors swung open. It was not a typical arrival. The background chatter of the restaurant did not just quiet down, it was cut off completely. Conversations died in the middle of words. Forks froze halfway to open mouths. Dominic Moretti had arrived. He was much taller than he appeared in the grainy tabloid photos. He had on a dark gray suit that fit him like a second skin, tailored to conceal the firearm everyone knew he carried. His dark hair was slicked back, revealing a face with sharp, chiseled features that showed no emotion at all. His eyes scanned the room once, a hunter testing the air before he turned just slightly. He was not alone, and he did not have a model on his arm or a lieutenant at his side. He was extending his arm to an elderly woman. She was petite, wearing a modest black dress with a lace collar that seemed straight out of the 1950s. Her hair was stark white, tied back in a tight bun. She clutched Dominic's arm so tightly that her knuckles were white. She appeared absolutely terrified. This was Isabella Moretti, a woman who was practically a ghost. Information about Dominic's mother was scarce. Some claimed she was unstable, others believed she was ill. The majority of people were not even aware she was still alive. She had disappeared from the public eye years ago. Dominic guided her through the hushed room. A team of 4 bodyguards surrounded them, their gazes sweeping every corner, watching for any sudden movements. They arrived at table 1, the private alcove hidden behind thick velvet curtains. Sophie was 3 tables over, pouring water for a couple who were bickering about their prenuptial agreement. She could feel the cold tension coming from their direction. She watched Pierre, the head waiter, sweating as he neared the table. Pierre was French, normally unflappable and notoriously arrogant. Right now, he looked like a man about to face a firing squad. "Good evening, Mr. Moretti," Pierre said, his voice trembling just a bit. "Madame, a pleasure to have you at the Onyx Room." Dominic paid him no mind. His attention was completely on his mother. He helped her into her chair, tucking her in with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his entire reputation. He straightened her shawl. He shifted a candle a little farther from her hand. "Ma," Dominic said. His voice was a low rasp. He leaned in toward her. "Are you all right?" The elderly woman gave no sign of hearing him. She was staring blankly at the white linen, her eyes glazed over and distant. She seemed lost, overwhelmed by the dim lights and the dancing flames of the candle. "She is fine," Dominic said, almost to himself, though his jaw clenched. He glanced at Pierre. "We require a moment. Get her some water. No ice, just room temperature." "At once, monsieur." Sophie observed this from a distance. She could see the strain in Dominic's posture. This was not the pressure of a crime lord worried about an attack. It was the stress of a son who could not help his mother. She knew that expression well. She had seen it on her own face countless times. 20 minutes went by. The unease in the restaurant had settled into an anxious buzz, but everyone's eyes kept flicking toward table 1. Something was clearly wrong. Pierre had approached the table on 3 separate occasions. Each time he backed away, he looked more stressed and frantic. Mr. Halloway was pacing by the kitchen entrance, wringing his hands together. Sophie was clearing a nearby table, trying to stay out of sight, but the sound of tense voices carried over from the alcove. I said, "Ask her what it is she wants." Dominic's voice was getting louder. It was not a yell, not yet, but it carried the low growl of an approaching storm. "I have attempted to, Mr. Moretti," Pierre stammered. "I described the evening's specials. I recommended the branzino. She is not responding." "She is not an idiot," Dominic shot back. "She is just—" He stopped himself, dragging a hand down his face. "Just get the menu again, the one that has pictures. Do you have a menu with pictures?" "This is a Michelin-starred restaurant, sir," Pierre said, his professional pride briefly winning over his sense of self-preservation. "We do not offer picture menus." Dominic shot to his feet. The chair legs screeched across the floor. The noise echoed like a gunshot. "Then you tell me what she wants to eat," Dominic growled. "She has not eaten in 2 days. She is frightened. She is disoriented. And you are just standing here spouting off French words she does not understand." "I am speaking English, sir." "She cannot hear you," Dominic roared. The entire room fell silent once more. Dominic stiffened, seeming to realize he had shouted. He looked back at his mother. Isabella had not even reacted to his outburst. She was still looking at the tablecloth, pulling at a small loose thread, lost in her own silent world. "She is deaf," Dominic said, his voice sinking to a menacing whisper. "She lost her hearing 3 years ago. The hearing aids bother her skin. She will not wear them. She can read lips, but the lighting in here is too dim. She is not able to see your mouth. Pierre looked completely lost. I could bring a notepad. She has arthritis, Dominic spat out. She cannot hold a pen for very long. Look at her hands. Isabella's hands were crooked, her fingers twisted from the disease. She looked toward Dominic, her eyes filled with confusion. She let out a small, frustrated noise, a sound from the back of her throat that people who cannot hear sometimes make when trying to speak, without hearing their own voice. A few patrons nearby fidgeted in their seats. A woman in a red cocktail dress let out a nervous laugh. Dominic's head snapped in the direction of the laugh. His gaze was lethal. "Do you find something amusing?" he asked. The woman in red turned white. "No, I just—" "Get out," Dominic ordered. "I beg your pardon?" "Get out." The woman and her date scrambled from their seats, abandoning their half-finished meals and nearly sprinting to the exit. Dominic looked back at Pierre. "I need somebody who can communicate with her. Right now. Find someone who knows sign language. ASL. You have 50 people on your staff. Surely one of them knows it." Holloway, the manager, scurried over. "Mr. Moretti, my deepest apologies. I do not think we have anyone on our staff with that specific skill. I could try to interpret myself if we wrote it on a tablet." "She despises screens," Dominic said, his patience completely gone. "She is convinced they are used for spying on her. I brought her here tonight because this place, 20 years ago, all I wanted was one decent meal. Just one." He glanced over at his mother. Tears were welling in Isabella's eyes. Her hand patted the table, searching for her water glass that was just beyond her reach. Dominic sighed, his voice full of defeat. "That is it. We are going." He started to move his mother's chair. This was the nightmare scenario. If Moretti stormed out, the Onyx Room's reputation would be ruined. Vendors would cut them off. Health inspectors would show up. The restaurant would be shuttered within a month. Holloway frantically scanned his employees. "Does anyone here know sign language? A $5,000 bonus right now." The staff stared at the floor. The kitchen crew just shook their heads. Pierre pretended to study the ceiling. Sophie stood frozen by the service station. Her heart was pounding against her ribs like a drum. She could do it. Her little brother Toby had been deaf from birth. For 10 years, she was his connection to the hearing world, until meningitis took him 2 years ago. Her hands still knew the language. Her soul still understood the quiet. But stepping up to Dominic Moretti, the man who had just thrown a couple out for laughing too loud, everyone whispered his name in terror. "Don't you dare, Sophie," her mind screamed at her. "Just stay invisible." She looked at Dominic, who was now struggling to get his mother to her feet. Isabella resisted, confused and hurt, certain she was the reason they were leaving early. She looked so frail. In that moment, Sophie saw her own grandmother's face, and she saw Toby's frustration. Before she could think twice, her feet were moving. Sophie took one step, and then another. "Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice a fragile whisper. Holloway spun toward her. "Bennett? What is it?" "Not now." Sophie swallowed hard, clutching her tray like a shield. "I can help." Dominic paused his efforts. He slowly turned to look at her. Sophie felt his stare like a physical weight. His eyes traveled from her worn-out shoes all the way up to her messy bun. He looked unconvinced, almost offended that this trembling waitress dared to speak. "You?" Dominic's tone was sharp. "You know American Sign Language?" "Yes, sir," Sophie whispered. "I am fluent." Dominic sized her up for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he nodded toward the table. "You have 2 minutes," he warned. "If this is a waste of my time, you will not have a job in this town again." Sophie simply nodded. She placed her tray on a nearby stand, took a shaky breath, and straightened her apron. She walked right past a dumbfounded Pierre and a horrified Holloway, and entered the candlelight around table 1. She focused on Isabella, not Dominic. She knelt by the woman's chair. It was a serious violation of the rules. Staff were always supposed to stand. But Sophie knew she needed to be seen to be understood. She had to be on the same level. Isabella flinched as Sophie came into view, her eyes darting nervously to her son. Sophie gave her a real smile, a warm and genuine one. She raised her hands. "Hello," Sophie signed, her motions confident and smooth. "My name is Sophie. It is a pleasure to meet you." Isabella stared, her eyes growing wide. The fear on her face began to fade, replaced by pure astonishment. Dominic stood over them like a hawk, his hand resting near his coat. Isabella hesitantly lifted her own hands, their movements made slow and clumsy by arthritis. "You have speaking hands," Isabella signed in reply. "Yes," Sophie signed back. "I am your server tonight. The food is wonderful, but the chef is very grumpy." Isabella blinked, and then the smallest smile appeared on her lips, followed by a quiet, breathy laugh. "My son is also grumpy," she signed, with a little gesture toward Dominic. Sophie looked up at him. He was just staring, his jaw slightly slack, watching the conversation unfold. "He loves you more than anything," Sophie signed to his mother. "He just wants you to enjoy your dinner. What would you like to eat? Maybe something soft, or something with a little spice." Isabella's shoulders relaxed, visibly dropping 3 inches. The tension just melted away. She leaned closer to Sophie. "I want the scallops," she signed, "and a glass of red wine. But do not tell him. He says I should only drink water." Sophie chuckled softly, then turned to Dominic. "Sir, she would like the scallops and a glass of Pinot Noir. She also asked that I not mention the wine to you." Dominic's gaze shifted to his mother. Isabella just gave him a challenging look, clutching her napkin. For the first time that evening, the hard look in Dominic's eyes softened. He looked at Sophie, truly looked at her. "She wants wine?" he asked, his voice much quieter now. "Yes, sir." "Bring her the entire bottle," Dominic ordered. Sophie turned back to Isabella and signed. "He says, of course, you are the boss." Isabella lit up. She reached out and gently patted Sophie's cheek. Dominic slowly sat back down. The bodyguards eased up. Holloway nearly collapsed against a wall with relief. "What was your name again?" Dominic asked, his eyes fixed on Sophie. "Sophie, sir. Sophie Bennett." "Sophie," he said again, as if tasting the name. "You are not going anywhere, Sophie. You will be serving this table tonight. Only you. Tell Pierre he is not needed." "Yes, sir." Sophie got to her feet on trembling legs. She had done it. She had survived. But as she walked toward the kitchen, she felt Dominic's eyes on her. It was a different kind of look now. He was studying her like a puzzle he had to solve. And that is when she saw him. A man at the bar, 3 seats down, was watching the whole scene in the mirror's reflection. He was not looking at Dominic. He was looking at her. When their eyes met, he tapped the side of his nose twice. A chill shot down Sophie's spine. It was a signal. She hurried to the kitchen, her pulse racing. The doors swung shut, cutting off the dining room and throwing her back into the clamor of the kitchen. But the sounds were muffled, drowned out by the blood pounding in her ears. Holloway rushed over, his face beaming. "Bennett, you are a miracle worker. I heard them laughing, actually laughing. The Moretti table is happy. Do you have any idea what this means for us?" Sophie grabbed the edge of a steel counter to steady herself, her knuckles turning white. "I just need a moment, Mr. Holloway." "Take 5 minutes. Take 10. Grab a dessert." Holloway was practically giddy. "Just get back out there and keep the matriarch happy. If you pull this off, a promotion is definitely in your future." Sophie gave a weak nod and escaped into the dry storage pantry, pulling the door shut. In the dim light, surrounded by sacks of rice and canned goods, she let the panic wash over her. She slid to the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees. The man at the bar. She knew who he was, not by name, but by reputation. That was Mick, the Rat. O'Shea. He was an enforcer for the O'Hanlon crew, the Irish mob that ran the South Side. They were the very reason her father had skipped town 5 years ago, leaving her and her grandmother with a massive debt that never got smaller. That nose tap was not a friendly gesture. It was a clear message. We are watching you. We know this job. We know you're home. And now, the O'Hanlons had just seen her getting friendly with Dominic Moretti, their biggest rival in the city. To Mick, this did not look like good customer service. This looked like she was choosing a side. Breathe, she signed to herself in the darkness. Just breathe. She could not leave. If she did, they would find her grandmother. She had no choice but to see the night through and act like nothing was wrong. Sophie splashed some water on her face from a sink, adjusted her apron, and forced herself to walk back out onto the floor. As she came to table 1, the entire mood had been transformed. The awful silence was replaced by a quiet warmth. Isabella was enjoying her scallops, her hands moving quickly as she told Dominic a story. Dominic was leaning in, watching her with a painful intensity. He was trying his best to follow along, but he was only catching every other word. Sophie stepped back into the light. Dominic looked up, and for a brief moment, all his defenses were down. He actually looked happy to see her. "She is telling me a story," he said quietly. "Something about a bird." Sophie watched Isabella's flying fingers. The blue jay snatched the ribbon right from the railing. "Your father thought it was so funny he spilled his coffee all over himself." "It was a blue jay," Sophie translated for him as she refilled Isabella's wine. "It stole a ribbon from the porch, and your father laughed so hard he spilled his coffee." Dominic's eyes widened in recognition. A small, real smile finally appeared on his face. "I remember that day. I was 6 years old. It was the ribbon from my birthday gift." He looked at his mother and nodded, making a clumsy sign for "I remember." Isabella clapped her hands together in silent delight, her eyes crinkling at the corners. She turned to Sophie. "He was such a messy child," Isabella signed. "Always had dirt on his pants. Now he only wears these dark suits. He looks like he runs a funeral home." Sophie had to suppress a giggle. "She says you were a messy kid, and now you dress like a funeral director." Dominic actually chuckled. It was a deep, rough sound, like an old engine finally turning over. The unexpected noise made heads turn all across the dining room. The entire staff froze in place. A deep laugh rumbled from Dominic Moretti. "Tell her these suits are worth more than this building," Dominic said, his gaze fixed on Sophie. A current passed between them, something more than just gratitude. It was the unique bond of translation. Sophie was the connection between his emotions and his mother's thoughts. To a man who managed everything except this one silence, Sophie was the most powerful person there. "So, Sophie," Dominic said, relaxing in his chair while swirling his wine, "how did you learn? You mentioned you were fluent." "My brother," Sophie answered softly. "Toby." "He was born deaf." The past tense did not escape Dominic's notice. "He passed on 2 years ago." A shadow of sympathy crossed Dominic's face. "I am so sorry, for what it is worth." "He would have really liked you," Sophie lied. Toby would have been petrified of Dominic. He admired men who took care of their mothers. Dominic just stared at her. The air crackled with tension. "And what about you?" Dominic asked. "Who looks out for you, Sophie?" The question lingered, thick with unspoken meaning. A shiver traced a path up Sophie's spine. She glanced over at the bar's entrance. The stool Mick had occupied was now vacant, but something sat on the countertop. It was a cocktail napkin, held down by a cherry stem. "I can handle myself, sir," Sophie replied, her voice shaky. "I do not think so," Dominic murmured. He slipped a hand into his jacket and produced a business card. The card was black, with only a golden phone number embossed on its surface. "If you have any trouble, from management or customers, call this line directly, 24 hours a day." He pushed the card over the white linen. Sophie looked at it, Accepting that card felt dangerous. It was an agreement, but rejecting it could be an insult. Isabella reached over and gently tapped Sophie's hand. Take it. He is like a bear, but a good bear. Sophie accepted the card, tucking it inside her apron. Thank you, Mr. Moretti. Dominic, he corrected her. Mr. Moretti was my father, and I am sure he is the one who spilled that coffee. The dinner slowly came to an end. Isabella declined dessert but requested some tea. By the time they were leaving, the restaurant was preparing to close. Dominic rose and assisted his mother with her thick wool coat. He looked at Sophie. Walk with us to the door? He asked. It felt more like a command. Sophie escorted them to the valet station. The wind blowing off Lake Michigan was harsh, piercing her thin uniform. The bodyguards moved into their formation. A polished black sport utility vehicle pulled up. Before she entered, Isabella hugged Sophie. It was a surprisingly strong, bony embrace. Thank you, little bird, she signed. Dominic waited by the open car door. The streetlights threw sharp shadows on his face. He saw Sophie shivering from the cold. Do you have a coat? He questioned. It is inside. I need to finish my work. Of course. He paused, as if he wanted to add something more. The gratuity is included. But this? He pushed a folded stack of bills into her palm. This is for the dialogue. You gave me my mother back tonight. I do not forget such favors, Sophie. It was my pleasure, Dominic. He met her eyes for a moment too long, then gave a slight nod and entered the car. The heavy door clicked shut. The vehicle sped off, vanishing into the Chicago evening. Sophie remained there for a second, gripping the money. She felt a warmth spread through her despite the chill. Then, she recalled the napkin. She hurried back inside, weaving past the staff who were clearing tables, and made her way to the bar. The napkin was still there. She lifted it. Scrawled in a jagged red ink, likely from a drink stirrer, were 3 words. The alley. Now. Sophie's stomach plummeted. She glanced at the rear exit. The alley was the only route to the employee lockers and the bus stop. She checked the front entrance. It was locked. The manager had lowered the security gate. The only way out was through the back. She was cornered. The alley behind the Onyx room was a tight channel of brick and steam. Dumpsters were pushed against one wall, overflowing with the evening's trash. A single unsteady bulb over the steel exit door provided the only light. Sophie walked out, pulling her coat tightly around her neck. The frigid air was thick with the smell of garbage and snow. She held her purse strap in both hands until her knuckles turned white. Hello? She called out softly. There was only silence, the faint siren in the distance, and the dripping sound from a climate control unit. She began to walk quickly with her head lowered, aiming for the streetlight at the alley's end. Her steps echoed against the damp concrete. Click, clack, click, clack. Then, a figure separated itself from the shadows. Sophie! A voice hissed. Sophie gasped and whirled around. Mick O'Shea emerged into the faint light. He was a thin man with a sharp face and eyes like chips of ice. He wore a cheap leather jacket and chewed on a toothpick. Behind him, 2 other men stepped out from behind the dumpsters. They were larger, moved slower, and had on hooded sweatshirts. Mick, Sophie exhaled. I do not have the money. Not until the 1st of the month. You know the arrangement. Mick chuckled. It was a harsh, grating noise. He moved toward her, invading her personal space. She could smell old cigarettes and peppermint liquor on his breath. This is not about the money, sweetheart. Though your interest is certainly adding up. Grandma's care is not cheap, is it? Leave her out of this, Sophie said, her voice trembling. I am just a worried citizen, Mick mocked. He reached out, touching the collar of her coat. We were watching you tonight with the butcher, looking very close. A lot of gesturing, a lot of smiling. I was just performing my duties, Sophie stammered, stepping back until she was against the cold brick wall. His mother is deaf. I was just interpreting, that is all. Mick slammed a hand on the wall beside her head. Sophie flinched, letting out a small whimper. Do not lie to me, Mick growled. You were whispering to him. You were smiling. Moretti never smiles. What did you say? Did you mention us? Or your father's debt? No, I promise. We only discussed the food. Nonsense, Mick spat. He leaned forward until his nose almost brushed against hers. This is the situation, Sophie. You are in a very special position. You are going to be our informant now. Since you are so skilled with your hands, you will use them to assist us. What? What are you saying? The next time he visits, you listen. You learn where he is moving the shipment next Thursday, and you find out who he is seeing. Mick grinned, showing stained teeth. And if you refuse, well, old women have very fragile bones. Accidents are common in nursing homes. A fall down the stairs, a slip in the bathtub. Sophie felt sick to her stomach. Please, I cannot. He would kill me. He might, Mick shrugged. But I certainly will. So, make your choice. The butcher or the snitch. He reached into her pocket. Sophie stood frozen. He extracted the wad of cash Dominic had given her. Think of this as your first payment, Mick said, stuffing the money in his pocket. Now leave, and remember, we are watching you. Mick started to leave, his thugs laughing behind him. Sophie slid down the wall, hot tears streaming down her face. She felt nauseous. The money was gone. She was caught between two rival gangs, and her grandmother was in danger. Hey, Mick, a voice called from the darkness. It was not Sophie's voice. It was deep, composed, and carried a chilling authority. Mick stopped dead. He turned around slowly to face the alley's entrance. A figure was outlined by the streetlights. The red glow of a cigar briefly lit up a strong jawline. It was Dominic Moretti. He was not by himself. Two of his bodyguards, who were huge men in wool coats, were blocking the way out. Mr. Moretti? Mick stammered, all his confidence gone. We were just talking with the girl. We are old family friends. Dominic took a slow draw from his cigar and let out a cloud of smoke. He strode forward, his steps heavy and measured. He came to a halt 3 feet from Mick, looming over him. She is a waitress, Mick, Dominic said in a casual tone. She serves pasta. She pours wine. She does not associate with people like you. It is just a misunderstanding, Dom, Mr. Moretti. Her father owed the O'Sheas. We are only collecting the debt. Is that so? Dominic looked past Mick toward Sophie, who was huddled by the wall. She was trembling uncontrollably. For a brief moment, Dominic's eyes softened, then they turned to black ice as he looked back at Mick. She served my mother this evening, Dominic said quietly. She made my mother happy. Do you have any idea how uncommon that is? Look, take the money, Mick pleaded, pulling the cash from his pocket and extending it with a shaky hand. You can have it. We are even. Dominic glanced at the cash, then his eyes settled on Mick's hand. You touched her, Dominic said. It was a statement, not a question. You put your hands in her pockets. Get him. The command was barely audible. The two bodyguards moved with incredible speed. Before Mick could even cry out, he was slammed against the dumpster. The other two thugs exchanged a look and then ran, sprinting past Dominic. Dominic did not even glance their way. He allowed them to escape. He was only interested in the main rat. Dominic approached Mick. He removed the cigar from his mouth and studied its glowing end. This is my town, Dominic said softly. And the people working in this place, the employees, they are also mine. If you tax them, you are taxing me. If you threaten them, you are threatening me. I am sorry. I did not realize, Mick cried out. You realized. Dominic plucked the cash from Mick's grasp. He turned and went over to Sophie. He knelt down, ignoring the icy slush that was soaking into the knees of his expensive suit. He offered her the money. Are you all right? He asked. Sophie shook her head, unable to form words. She was shivering so violently that her teeth began to chatter. When she attempted to stand, her legs gave out from under her. Dominic was there to catch her. His grasp was solid, warm, and felt unbelievably strong. He pulled her upright, holding her steady against his chest. She caught the scent of expensive cologne, tobacco, and a trace of gunpowder. I cannot be seen with you, Sophie whispered, a fresh wave of panic rising. They will kill her. My grandmother. Dominic glanced down at her. No, they will not. He turned his attention back to Mick, who was still pinned by the guards. Listen to me very carefully, Mick. Dominic's voice cut through the wind. The dead is erased. The girl is off limits. The grandmother is off limits. If I hear that a single hair on their heads has been touched, or if she so much as trips on a crack in the sidewalk, I will find you. And I will take both of your hands so you can never again touch anything that belongs to me. Do you understand? Yes. Oh, God. Yes, Mick sobbed. Put him in the trash, Dominic commanded. The guards heaved Mick into a nearby open dumpster. He landed with a sickening thud and a cry of pain. Dominic then gave his undivided attention back to Sophie. He removed his thick overcoat and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was heavy and warm, completely enveloping her. My car is just around the corner, Dominic stated. I am taking you home. I cannot, Sophie feebly protested. This only makes things worse. Sophie, Dominic said, gripping her by the shoulders. He made her meet his gaze. You are not invisible any longer. You tried to be, but that is over. You stepped into the light to help my mother. Now you are in my light, and nothing can harm what is in my light. He paused, letting his words sink in. Now, he said softly, where does your grandmother live? We need to post some men to watch the nursing home, just in case. Sophie stared up at him. She could see the violence he was capable of. Of course. But she also saw the man who had remembered a blue jay and a simple ribbon. She understood with a terrifying clarity that she had merely swapped a debt to a street thug for a debt to the king. Rogers Park, she whispered. She is at St. Jude's. Dominic gave a slight nod. He steered her toward the end of the alley, his arm protectively around her shoulders. Let us go, he said. You are quitting that job tomorrow. What? I cannot. I need that money. You will not be a waitress anymore, Sophie, Dominic explained, as he opened the passenger door to his SUV. My mother needs a companion, someone who speaks her language, and I need someone I can trust. He paused, his dark eyes fixed on her. And at this moment, you are the only person in Chicago who has not told me a lie. The Moretti estate was in Lake Forest, a massive compound of limestone and wrought iron concealed behind a gate that looked strong enough to stop a tank. To the rest of the world, it was a historic property. To the criminal underworld, it was the fortress from which Dominic Moretti controlled Chicago's future. For Sophie, it was a beautiful cage, but one that offered a warmth she had never experienced before. 2 weeks had gone by since that night in the alley. Sophie had resigned from the Onyx Room the very next morning. Her grandmother, Rose, was now in a private suite at St. Jude's, financed by a shell corporation Sophie was sure traced back to Dominic. A security team, discreet but clearly capable, was stationed outside Rose's room. Sophie now occupied a room in the guest wing of the Moretti mansion, a space larger than her old apartment, with a view of the frozen lake. Her duties were straightforward. Be Isabella's voice. Be her companion. Every morning, Sophie would join Isabella in the sunroom. They would share tea and play chess, and they communicated. Sophie's hands moved quickly, translating the daily news, the household gossip, and the memories Isabella had kept locked away. Isabella was thriving. The confusion that had clouded her at the restaurant was clearing. Now that she could communicate again, her sharp mind was on full display. One Tuesday morning, Isabella signed while watching Dominic through the glass doors of his study. He was pacing back and forth on a phone call, his tie loosened and a frown on his face. He loves you, Sophie said out loud, and then signed the words. He wants you to be safe. Safety is dull, Isabella signed back with a flick of her wrist. I want grandchildren. I want this house to be noisy. I want him to look at a woman the way he looks at you when he believes no one is watching. Sophie felt a blush creep up her neck, almost making her drop her teacup. He does not look at me that way. I am deaf, little bird, not blind. Sophie glanced toward the study. Dominic? He stopped pacing and looked up, his eyes meeting hers through the glass. His scowl faded, giving way to a soft, barely there nod. The connection felt like a live wire humming between them. Later that night, the sheer reality of her new life finally hit her. Dominic entered the library where Sophie was reading a book. He looked completely worn out. His knuckles were bruised, and a dark spatter he had tried to scrub from his cuff was still visible. "How was she today?" Dominic asked, pouring some whiskey for himself. He did not offer her a glass. He knew she did not drink. "She is happy," Sophie said, marking her page. "She defeated me in chess twice, and she wants to attend the opera gala on Saturday." Dominic froze completely. The glass stopped just before it reached his mouth. "The charity ball event? Absolutely not." Sophie spoke softly. "She saw the invitation on your desk. She has been going on about it all day long. She mentioned not having worn her emeralds in 5 years. She just wants to feel normal." "Dominic, it is not safe," Dominic said, his voice turning hard. "The Owanians have been quiet since the alley. Far too quiet. If I take her out in public, it creates a security nightmare." "She is your mother, not a prisoner," Sophie countered, surprising even herself with her own boldness. Dominic turned on her, his eyes flashing with anger. "Do you have any idea of what happens if I make a mistake? Do you understand what men like Mick O'Shea do to get leverage over a man like me? They do not come for me. They come for what I love." He stopped speaking. The silence that followed felt deafening. "What I love." The words had slipped out. The meaning of them hung heavily in the air. He was talking about his mother, of course, but the way he stared at Sophie with intensity, hunger, and fear suggested the list of people he loved had recently grown by one. Sophie rose to her feet and walked toward him. She was not the shy waitress from the restaurant. Living in this house, witnessing the weight he shouldered, had made her brave. "She needs this," Sophie whispered. "And perhaps so do you. You cannot keep everyone locked away in a glass box forever." Dominic looked down at her. He lifted his rough hand, his fingers brushing against her cheek. His thumb softly traced her bottom lip. "If we go," he said, his voice raspy, "you must stay right beside her. You do not leave her side for even a moment. You are her ears. You are her protector." "I will not leave her," Sophie promised. "And Sophie." Dominic leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. "If anything happens, if you notice anything at all, you come to me. You do not try to be a hero. You run straight to me. I promise." He kissed her then. It was not a gentle kiss. It was filled with desperation, tasting of whiskey and fear, and a longing so powerful it felt like drowning. When he finally pulled back, he looked like a man who had just sealed his own fate. "Get a dress," he said gruffly, turning his face away. "Something expensive." "We are going to the opera." The Chicago Lyric Opera House was a grand space of gold leaf and red velvet, alive with the city's most powerful people. Senators mingled with tech billionaires, while crime lords in expensive tuxedos clinked glasses with judges. It was the one night a year when the boundaries of the law became blurred under the cover of philanthropy. Sophie wore a midnight blue silk gown, with long sleeves and an open back, which Isabella had picked for her. She felt elegant, but also incredibly vulnerable. She remained at Isabella's side constantly, her eyes scanning the crowd, her hands always ready to translate. Dominic was like a stone statue in his tuxedo. He navigated the room with a deadly grace, shaking hands and offering tight smiles, but his eyes never stopped scanning the area. His most trusted men were positioned around the room, their earpieces hidden from view. Isabella was glowing. She held court, smiling as people came up to them, waiting for Sophie to sign their compliments. "They are all snakes," Isabella signed privately, while keeping a polite smile on her face. That man over there in the gray suit owes Dominic $2 million. Sophie had to suppress a laugh. He says you look beautiful, Mrs. Moretti. Everything appeared to be normal until the intermission. The guests began moving toward the grand staircase to get champagne. The room grew louder, a mix of laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the orchestra tuning up. Sophie felt a strange prickle on the back of her neck. She looked up at the mezzanine level. A group of waiters was weaving through the crowd carrying trays. One of them, a tall man with a scar over his lip, was not watching his tray. His gaze was fixed on Dominic. Sophie observed him closely. She knew the flow of restaurant service. She knew the way a waiter should move. This man moved with the discipline of a soldier. He lifted a hand as if to scratch his ear. Then, he tapped the side of his nose. Sophie's blood ran cold. It was the signal, the exact same one Mick had used at the Onyx Room. She looked across the balcony. Another waiter, standing near the entrance to a private box, tapped his nose in reply. It was more than a signal. It was a countdown. Sophie looked for Dominic. He was 10 feet away, caught in a conversation with the mayor. The noise from the crowd was a deafening roar. If she yelled, he might not hear her, or even worse, the shooters might panic and start firing into the crowd. Isabella was right beside her. She had to warn him, but she could not make a sound. Sophie moved directly into Dominic's line of sight. She did not wave. She did not shout. She simply lifted her hands to... Her face was a calm mask, but her eyes locked onto his from across the room. Dominic saw her and stopped talking mid-sentence. "Trap," Sophie signed, her motions sharp and precise like a soldier's. 3 men. They look like waiters. North balcony. West exit. Armed. Dominic never broke his smile. He didn't glance toward the balcony or betray any alarm. He simply nodded at the mayor. "Mr. Mayor, please excuse me for a moment," Dominic said with perfect calm. "I think my mother could use some fresh air." As he turned, his hand moved to the small of his back. He tapped his earpiece twice in a distinct rhythm. "Code Black," he whispered. "Mezzanine, disguised as staff." Then chaos erupted. The assassin on the balcony knew he'd been spotted. He reached inside his jacket, drawing a pistol with a silencer. "Down!" Dominic yelled, tackling the mayor while pushing Isabella toward Sophie. Sophie immediately pulled Isabella behind a large marble pillar, just as the stone exploded into dust from a spray of bullets. Screams filled the air as the elegant ballroom turned into a scene of pure panic. Guests trampled one another, desperate to reach the exits. Dominic was already returning fire with practiced skill. His bodyguards moved in, forming a human shield of flesh and Kevlar around the pillar. "Get them out of here," Dominic ordered his head of security, Luca. "Use the service elevator." "Dominic!" Sophie cried out, holding Isabella close. "Go!" Dominic's gaze met hers, his eyes fierce. "I will be right behind you. Now go!" Luca took hold of Sophie and Isabella, pulling them through a side door that led to the kitchen hallways. The pop of gunfire chased them, a terrifying and deafening sound. They raced down the corridor. Isabella was struggling to breathe, one hand on her chest, but she kept running. They finally reached the service elevator, and Luca repeatedly hit the call button. The doors creaked open. "Inside now," Luca commanded. Sophie shoved Isabella forward into the elevator. Just as she was about to step in herself, a thick metal fire door crashed down, sealing the hallway from the elevator bank, set off by the fire alarm. Luca and Isabella were safe inside the elevator, but Sophie was trapped on the other side. "Sophie!" Isabella's muffled scream came from behind the closing elevator doors as she pounded on the metal. "Go!" Sophie shouted back. "Get her to safety!" The elevator doors slid closed, leaving Sophie completely alone in the hall. She heard the sound of heavy boots running toward her on the tile floor. She turned to look. Down the long corridor, the fake waiter with the scar on his face appeared. He was bleeding from his shoulder, and his face was a mask of fury. He saw Sophie and sneered. "You," he spat out. "The little hand-talker." He leveled his pistol at her. Sophie stumbled backward, her shoes sliding on the slick floor. There was nowhere to run. The fire door behind her was sealed shut. She squeezed her eyes closed, bracing for the end. Bang! The gunshot was deafening, but Sophie felt no pain. She slowly opened her eyes. The assassin was sprawled on the floor, a clean hole in the middle of his forehead. Dominic stood over him, smoke drifting from the barrel of a silver Desert Eagle. His suit was a mess, his tie was gone, and his shirt was splattered with blood that was not his own. He stepped over the body, his intense gaze fixed on Sophie. He didn't say a word. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. He was trembling. The undisputed king of Chicago was trembling. "I told you," he whispered, burying his face in the crook of her neck, breathing her in. "I told you to stay with her." "The door!" Sophie cried, clutching the front of his ruined shirt. The fire door shut. "I could not get through." "It is okay," Dominic murmured, kissing her hair, her forehead, and her tear-stained cheeks. "You saved us all. You saved everyone. I saw you signing, I saw you." He gently pulled back to look at her, cupping her face in his hands. "In the middle of all that noise, you were able to speak to me. Nobody else could have ever done that." "Is she okay?" Sophie asked. "Luca is on the radio," Dominic said, his thumb softly stroking her cheek. "She is in the car. She is safe. But we need to go, now. The Oanians. This was a desperate last-ditch attack." He took her hand in his. "Can you run?" "Yes." "Then run with me," he said. "And do not let go." The war that erupted afterward lasted only 3 days. It was swift, it was brutal, and it was fought entirely in the city's shadows. By attempting the assassination at the opera, the Oanian family had gone too far. They had put civilians and politicians at risk, shattering the unwritten rules that governed the city. Dominic barely had to lift a finger. The other families, appalled by the recklessness and worried about the attention the shooting would bring, turned on the Oanians themselves. Mikosha's body was later discovered in the trunk of a car at O'Hare Airport. The rest of the Oanian leadership fled back to Ireland, knowing they could never show their faces in Chicago again. By the 4th day, a quiet settled over the city. But this was a new kind of quiet. It was the quiet that comes with peace. Sophie sat on the terrace of the Lake Forest estate, wrapped in a soft cashmere blanket. The winter sun was brilliant, glinting off the fresh snow. She watched as Isabella taught Dominic how to sign. They sat together on a bench near the garden, and Isabella was laughing as she corrected Dominic's clumsy finger spelling. "No, like this," Isabella signed. "Your thumb needs to be out." "You are signing donkey, not stubborn." Dominic frowned in concentration, trying to adjust his hand. "That is better," Isabella signed. "But you are still a donkey." Sophie smiled and carried a tray with cups of espresso over to them. Dominic looked up as she approached. The bruises on his face were finally starting to fade. He stood and took the tray from her. He placed it on the nearby stone table and then took her hand. "Sit down," he said. Sophie sat. Isabella watched them with a knowing twinkle in her eye. She picked up her espresso and thoughtfully turned her chair to face the lake, giving the two of them a moment of privacy. "The police report was released today," Dominic said softly. "They're officially calling it a gang-related disturbance. No names were mentioned. You are completely in the clear, Sophie. You can go back to your apartment. You can have your old life back. Your grandmother's medical bills have been paid in full for the next 10 years. You are free to go." A cold knot formed in Sophie's stomach. "Are you firing me?" Dominic stared out at the frozen lake. "I am giving you a way out. This life. You saw what happened at the opera. It is a dangerous life. It is an ugly one. You do not belong in this darkness, Sophie. You are far too good for it." He released her hand, and it felt like a physical blow. "I can have a car take you back to Rogers Park in the next hour." Sophie just looked at him. She could see the hurt in his eyes. He was trying to protect her in the only way he knew how, by sending her away. He was terrified that the next time the bullet would find its mark. She glanced over at Isabella, who was happily watching a bright red cardinal in the snow. She looked around at the large house, a fortress that had somehow started to feel like a home. Sophie got to her feet. Dominic flinched, clearly expecting her to leave. Instead, she walked over and stood right in front of him. She waited for him to meet her gaze, then she raised her hands. For 23 years, I was invisible. She signed slowly and deliberately. I was a ghost at the restaurant. I was a ghost in my own life. Dominic watched her hands, completely captivated. He understood every single word. He had been practicing. You saw me, she continued signing. You gave me a voice. If I return to that apartment, I will be invisible all over again. I do not want to be safe, Dominic. I want to be heard. She lowered her hands and spoke, her voice surprisingly strong and clear. I am not going anywhere, unless you do not want me here. Dominic rose slowly to his feet. He looked at this incredible woman, this small, shy waitress who had walked into a lion's den and had managed to tame all the beasts inside with nothing but her silence. I want you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I want you more than I want to take my next breath. Then stop trying to get rid of me. Dominic reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He looked down at it, then back up at her. I was going to wait, he confessed. Maybe 6 months, maybe a year, to do this the right way. But I almost lost you forever in that hallway, and I am done wasting time. He opened the box. Inside sat a ring with a vintage emerald cut stone, surrounded by tiny diamonds. It was Isabella's ring, one she had not worn for many years. My mother gave this to me this morning, Dominic explained. She said if I was foolish enough to let you leave, she would disown me. Sophie gasped, bringing her hands up to cover her mouth. Sophie Bennett, Dominic said, lowering himself to one knee in the snow. Will you be my voice? Will you be my heart? Will you marry me? Sophie glanced over at Isabella. The older woman had turned back around. She was grinning from ear to ear and gave Sophie a big 2 thumbs up. Sophie then turned back to Dominic. The King of Chicago was on his knees before her, waiting for her answer. She did not speak. She did not sign. She simply knelt down in the snow with him and gave him her answer with a kiss. And there, in the quiet of the winter garden, with a deaf mother and a red cardinal as their only witnesses, the shy waitress became a queen. The violence at the Onyx Room had started a war. But the silence that followed, that silence had started a new life. And that is the story of how Sophie Bennett went from pouring water for a living to ruling an empire. It was never about the guns, or the money, or the power. It was about finding the one thing Dominic Moretti could never buy. Someone who could truly understand him. In a world filled with constant noise, Sophie was the only person who actually knew how to listen. If you loved this story of danger, romance, and the incredible power of silence, please go ahead and smash that like button. It truly helps our channel grow. And do not forget to subscribe and hit that bell for notifications so you never miss another story. What do you think you would have done in that alleyway? Would you have taken the money, or would you have called Dominic? Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.